Hi, everyone, and welcome to the course of World History. I am your host, Mr. Samuelson, and today we are going to be looking at fighting in Asia, continuing in our unit in World War II. We've already looked at how the war went prior to American involvement. Today we're going to be looking a little bit into what happens once the Americans get involved, or how things are going kind of at that moment of American involvement. What were the early and long-term goals of Japan in World War II is what we're looking at. And let's see what's happening. So World War II is going to accelerate. Japan's had already invaded China. They've already conquered the Koreas. This has already happened sometime in the past, prior to 1941. But 1941 is rolling around, and the Japanese military is really getting starved for resources. They need a lot of different resources, but oil is a big one here. And this is going to lead them to look for ready available sources of oil close to Japan. And those territories are already controlled by European and American colonies. So to get that oil, they are going to have to turn on Europeans and Americans or halt their war machine. So the only threat to Japan in this area, because of course World War II is happening in Europe, Europeans are distracted. The only threat in the area is the Americans. The Japanese know this. They know that America could stand against them, could halt their efforts here, so something's got to be done. For the Japanese, that something winds up being a surprise attack on the American fleet as it is in dock at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. So 1941, December, Japan does launch a surprise attack on the American military base at Pearl Harbor. It does quite a bit of damage, but there were quite a few American ships that were not at harbor at that time, too. So it is hardly a crippling blow. Now, at the same time that this attack on Pearl Harbor is succeeding to do damage, but failing to destroy the fleet, it slows any American response. Americans do need to kind of take stock before they can immediately move against Japan. Japan, though, is not going to waste any time. On the same day as the Pearl Harbor attack, Japan attacks American colonies and British colonies throughout Southeast Asia and overwhelms their defenders there. These were areas that had not been greatly defended because of events in Europe. So Japan is able to use a very capable military to overwhelm these undermanned positions of the British and Americans. So by the spring of 1942, within a couple of months, Japan is in control of most of Southeast Asia. Now, what is Japan going to do here? What is their goal? Japan were close to achieving this goal of creating a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. This is what they called it. This is the idea that they would liberate all of Southeast Asia from the colonial governments of Europe and Americas. We don't like these colonists. We want to get rid of them and replace them. This was really Japan's goal, was not to get rid of imperialism and colonialism, but to make sure that East Asia was colonized and imperialized by East Asians. So Japan starts to tie these colonies together, starts to form networks between them. These trade networks are going to move goods back and forth, but predominantly it's going to be focused on exporting the raw materials that Japan needs to feed its military. We're talking steel, we're talking oil as the big ones. Why do they need all this steel and oil? Well, they got to conquer the rest of China. That is a big part of their goal. They've gotten a lot of China, they don't have all of it, and Japan is really going to go for that goal. Now, Japan's plans to do this, to take over China, and eventually from China they were going to go to India, really gets foiled by the entry of the United States into World War II. The Japanese Prime Minister, former General Togo, had hoped the U.S. would avoid this war, had hoped to avoid war with the U.S. because he'd hoped to completely destroy that fleet, had hoped to put U.S. in a military position where they couldn't respond to Japan. They didn't completely destroy that fleet. The U.S. is able to respond, and they will respond. Now, with Europe occupied by their Axis allies, Japan had hoped to freely conquer China, and from China take on India and really become the dominant power in Asia. Without the destruction of the U.S. fleet, though, all of that kind of needs to take, backseat. They know that the United States is going to respond. Or as Admiral Yamamoto said, "I fear all we have done is to waken the sleeping giant and fill him with terrible resolve." They didn't kill the sleeping giant. They simply woke it and angered it. The U.S. is not going to follow what Japan had hoped for, what Japan had planned. They've got other plans. America will enter the war. Now, before Pearl Harbor, Americans, the American people, they did not want to be involved in this. They wanted nothing to do with it. They still had memories of World War I and saw it as getting involved in affairs that weren't theirs. They didn't want to have anything to do with World War II. It was very unpopular. This attack, however, shows the people of America that they can't wait any longer. The war is coming to them. You can't be neutral. You can't sit back. You do have to pick a side. And by the way, one of those sides just attacked you. So how about you pick the other one? Once the U.S. declares war on Japan, Hitler will declare war on the United States because Japan is Germany's ally. U.S. declares war on Japan. Hitler steps up to defend his ally. And America will officially join the Allied powers. So it will be France, what remains of France, it's not much, the British, the Soviet Union, and the Americans against the Axis powers. The Allies do, however, decide on a Europe-first strategy. They realize that most of the Allied powers are in Europe. They need to be freed from the Nazi threat before they can really turn attention to Japan. So the war against Japan is really going to be one fought by the Americans and the Chinese. I want to include the Chinese as allies here. Militarily weaker, but numerically very strong. They put a lot into the fight. They're definitely one of those allied powers. But it's going to be mostly the U.S. that has to stand up against Japan. We'll look more at that and how the war comes to a close at another time. That's it for today. Thanks for joining me. I hope you learned something, and farewell.